Hi, my name is Josh Weiner. Here is part 1 of my film On the Waterfront-on-Steroids, The Rides of the District Wharf, which I've created this past semester as part of my Journalistic Content Production class here at Georgetown. As a native Washingtonian who's interested in the city's history and modern development, I was intrigued by the emergence of what has been the largest ongoing construction project in Washington over the past few years. Making a video telling the story of how the wharf came to be and where its long-term impact may lie seemed to be a fitting project for me. Out of the many theories we've looked at in class this semester, the theory of objectivity in reporting is possibly the one most relevant to this project. I've chosen this as a specific theory for the annotation assignment for a few reasons. One, this is one of the theories which my partner Zach Omer and I researched and presented to the class early on in the semester, so it's one of the ones that I'm most familiar with and comfortable commenting upon. Second, given that I've been active in student reporting and newspapers for a long time, especially in college, objective reporting is something which I've put a lot of thought into and am eager to reflect upon now that I have a new project underway. And third, objective reporting has been a concern of mine pretty much as soon as the idea for this movie struck me. How do I tell this story evenly, I wondered. I didn't want to simply make a promotional video about the wharf, and that was something that Dr. Kaliska also cautioned me about when I first suggested this topic. Now that I've carried the first part of the film to completion, I would like to determine whether I've indeed achieved objectivity within this film and whether there are some areas for improvement. A lot of the criteria for objectivity which I'm weighing my film against are taken from the piece we read for class, Objectivity as Strategic Ritual, an examination of newsmen's notions of objectivity by Gay Tuckman. This piece implies that many writers claim objectivity for practical or protective reasons. It's a, quote, strategic ritual protecting newspapermen from the risks of their trade, unquote, and that for some, quote, the word objectivity stands as a bulwark between them and their critics, unquote. Since I'm only making this movie for class, not broadcasting it on nationwide TV, I'm not sure if the risks of the trade really concern me. But I would like to think I've done a good job of obeying some of the objectivity criteria that Tuckman identifies in her essay. They are as follows. 1. The presentation of conflicting possibilities. Newspapermen must be able to identify facts, even though some truth claims are not readily verifiable. I'm not sure if this really applies to my video because I'm not working under the same kind of time crunch as newspaper reporters do. I've had all semester to investigate my topic, and none of the statements made by my interviewees are ones which I disagree with or am skeptical about. If I were, I would have expressed so in my narration leading into those statements. 2. The presentation of supporting evidence, using additional resources to back up the statements made by the interviewees. I'd say I've achieved this to a reasonable extent. When interviewees like Uwe Brandes and Philippa Ernst are talking about how rough and degraded parts of DC used to be, I've used old pictures from previous eras of Washington to prove their point. When Matthew Gilmore talks about how the city population has been falling since 1950, I used a graph to demonstrate just how steep that population drop really was. I could perhaps take this whole area further, but I'm limited by the public domain materials I'm able to access and the nature and scope of this video project. 3. Judicious use of quotation marks. By attributing statements to other people, not him or herself, the author can claim neutrality in his or her writing. That's the content which Tuckman evokes in her essay. Of course, in a film, I don't need to use quotation marks. The interviewees themselves are seen on screen presenting their own views aloud. The very nature of this project distinguishes my views from those with whom I spoke. And fourth and final, structuring information in an appropriate sequence. The structure of the video is different from the structure of a newspaper article that Tuckman is referring to, where the most important information is in the first paragraph and the information in the following paragraphs is of decreasing importance. I'm telling my story in chronological order, at least in part 1, and I'm satisfied with the structure I've chosen. It's important to establish some of the historical precedent to the construction of the wharf, why urban redevelopment was so urgent in DC by the turn of the century, how those redevelopment efforts spilled over from northwest DC to the other poorer quadrants, and finally wound up on the shores of the once essentially vacant southwest waterfront. It could be argued that my objectivity here is compromised by having a disproportionate amount of some interviewees, especially Brandes and Ernst, early on in the film. I think I'll work on ironing this out better when I work on my own time to complete this film over the course of the coming summer. All of this is how I believe I've responded to Tuchman's objectivity criteria. Have I stayed even in the coverage of my topic, though? My opinion of the wharf as expressed in the film is definitely a positive one. Whereas we learned in class, not by any means does being objective mean you have no right to express your opinion, only that you take a balanced approach to your subject matter. This relates to one of Tuchman's criteria of objective reporting, which Zach and I touched upon when we presented to the class back in January. The notion of interorganizational relationships. Is the story based upon a wide variety of sources who have developed a general consensus, essentially? I believe that I've managed to stay objective in the film by interviewing people from many different fields. Some of them are directly relevant to the wharf project itself, either because they were the driving forces behind it, like Mr. Seaman from P.N. Hoffman and the Georgetown professor who was on the board that greenlit the project, or because they now are running businesses which are active on the wharf, like the employees at Politics and Prose and The Anthem. They've been able to give me clear perspectives on what living and working there has been like, along with elaborating on the significance of the project to their companies. Others don't have the same sort of direct connection to the wharf, but are still knowledgeable about issues related to this project. It's been valuable to hear from some Southwest DC residents, a DC historian, and a high school friend of mine who's now active in real estate development. I've used outside perspectives such as these to show how the wharf bears significance to people all across the Washington area as a new entertainment district, as an influential new component to their neighborhood, and so on. Having spoken with such a great breadth of individuals of various backgrounds, I think I've drawn some clear consensuses. These include that 1. Urban redevelopment was critical in Washington, given how badly neglected much of the city had become and the poverty and crime that had resulted from that trend. 2. Certain parts of Southwest DC really needed attention as well, including the Southwest Waterfront, a massive chunk of land without much ever going on there. 3. The wharf managed to go up without disrupting much residential life, since there previously was no housing allowed in the Southwest Waterfront. The city did not permit it. That puts it at a major contrast with other construction projects in DC's history, especially the urban renewal program of the 1960s, the last substantial development project in the Southwest Quadrant. And 4. The wharf really wanted to preserve DC's character as it was being constructed. Adding local businesses like Politics and Prose, The Anthem, the local bike hardware store, some local restaurants, and so on, all contributed to this intention. The people working at these places are all very happy with how things have gone so far, and by the new opportunities which expanding to the wharf represents for them as independent organizations. All of these are positive points which have been relayed multiple times by many of my interviewees. So in that sense, I've succeeded in balanced reporting with my piece by conveying them across the board. Are there perhaps ways in which I could take my goal of objective reporting further? Objectivity is achieved by including a strong range of perspectives, and while I've done that to a respectful extent, I feel I could do better. It would be nice to include more perspectives from businesses in Southwest that are now going to have to coexist with the wharf. I contacted Arena Stage and the Southwest Fish Market, two institutions that are essentially adjacent to the wharf, but that attempt to secure an interview didn't materialize. That would have been a valuable angle to include in this story for sure. Not only would speaking with more individuals be useful for this piece, but so would including more racial diversity. I'm sure that some critics might accuse me of having too many white men commenting in my film. Interviewing two women helps me to curtail that, but I would really like to include some African Americans' perspectives, especially from residents living in Southwest DC. The African American presence in that region and the rest of DC is still very high, but that demographic has declined in both regards as urban redevelopment and gentrification has accelerated over the last few decades. Speaking with an African American resident would have allowed me to better express this part of the story, along with improving the racial diversity of my interviewee profile, and in turn, the pure objectivity of my film. I think it would have been especially valuable to find someone from the older generation who was displaced by the urban renewal program 50 years ago and hear from them about whether a project like the wharf might be opening up old wounds. More broadly, I think the piece could be more objective if it touched more upon some of the negative sides of the Wharf project. I'll be able to express some of these in part 2 once I work on that over the summer, but here are some of the general reservations I have heard, especially by some local Southwest residents. One is that the wharf feels like an artificial component to the neighborhood, not a natural addition. 2, it may have the negative effect of pricing people out of the region and incurring future gentrification. I think that this is less of a concern than it was for other construction projects in DC, given that the wharf was built on basically empty land and had no residential units to be demolished. But perhaps some people would argue that the wharf will encourage further development projects in other parts of the city where this may in fact be a problem. And 3, something like the wharf may threaten to worsen the congestion in DC. Anyone who's had to drive into the city from the suburbs for work knows that traffic can be pretty rough. Does installing 1,000 new residents right by downtown and right by the ever-crowded 14th Street Bridge worsen that situation at all? I'm sure P.N. Hoffman has taken all of these potential consequences into strong consideration and devised ways to respond to them. But these are still clearly issues to take into strong account based on some of the insight I was provided in my interviews. There are ways in which I might be able to improve the objectivity and even coverage of the film and its subject matter. But overall, I feel like I've taken important measures to ensure the film has achieved an important degree of objectivity. It's definitely not a promo video for The Wharf, which I wanted to avoid from the get-go, in the sense that it's not a quick, surface-skimming glamorization of the project. Instead, my film places The Wharf in conversation with the rest of the change in construction that Washington has gone through lately. The positive points my movie makes regarding The Wharf are ones which are supported by interview excerpts and consensus statements coming from multiple parties. In the end, I think Gay Tuchman would approve of the ways in which I've met her criteria for objectivity, and I hope that viewers that watch the finished film will appreciate the range of perspectives I've included and the reasoning I've used to back up my arguments in what is, for the most part, a solidly objective video. Thank you.